There are some stories that feel larger than life, some journeys that capture not just fame, but the very essence of human struggle, redemption, and destiny. And then, there are rare individuals whose existence reshapes entire industries, whose choices revive dying dreams, and whose spirit reminds us all that no matter how deep we fall, there is always a way to rise again. Robert Downey Jr. is not just a Hollywood superstar, not just the actor who wore the Iron Man suit, but a living reminder that when life pushes you into the abyss, you can still rebuild, reinvent, and rise beyond imagination. He was more than a man playing a superhero. He became the very embodiment of one. But let's go back before the fame, before the billion-dollar franchises, before Marvel became a household name across every corner of the world. Robert's life was anything but smooth. He was born in New York in 1965 to a family that was anything but ordinary. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was a filmmaker, creative, experimental, rebellious, and his mother, Elsie, was also an actress. From the very beginning, Robert was raised in an environment where art was life. But with that came chaos. His father struggled with substance abuse, and by the time Robert was 6 years old, he was already introduced to drugs. Imagine that. At an age where most children are learning how to play with toys, he was learning how to fight demons that no child should ever even see. It didn't take long for that environment to shape him. Yes, he was talented, yes, he had charisma that stood out, but behind the charm was a boy who carried confusion, vulnerability, and the dangerous allure of addiction. As he grew older, he didn't just carry his father's artistic bloodline, he carried his battles too. Robert Downey Jr. was a child of Hollywood chaos, and Hollywood would later be both his greatest blessing and his most brutal curse. His acting journey began young. He appeared in his father's films, played small roles, and by the 1980s he was carving a name for himself. He was part of Saturday Night Live, he starred in films like Less Than Zero, and people started whispering about his brilliance. But brilliance often walks hand in hand with self-destruction, and Robert's life began to spiral out of control. Addiction tightened its grip on him, and soon it wasn't about his talent anymore. It was about his arrests, his rehab stints, his fall from grace. By the mid-1990s, Robert Downey Jr. was one of Hollywood's most tragic stories. His mugshots were everywhere. The media painted him as unreliable, studios stopped calling, and the world began to write him off. It's easy for people to celebrate you when you're winning, but when you fall, the same voices that once cheered for you now whisper about your failure. And Robert was falling hard. There were times he went to jail, times when he was so consumed by addiction that people wondered if he would survive at all. Imagine being blessed with incredible talent, but being trapped in a cage of your own mistakes. Imagine waking up and not knowing if the world will ever trust you again. That was Robert's reality. Hollywood is unforgiving, and second chances are rare. But life has a way of testing those who are destined for greatness. And then came the turning point. It wasn't overnight. Redemption never is. It was slow, painful, and filled with doubt. Robert had to face himself. He had to admit that he couldn't keep running from his demons. He found strength in support systems, in people who still believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. One of those people was his wife, Susan Levin, a film producer he met in 2003. Susan became the anchor he desperately needed. While the world saw Robert as a fallen star, she saw the man he could be. She didn't just love him, she challenged him, pushed him, and believed in his comeback when no one else did. Now here's where destiny weaves its magic. In the mid-2000s, Marvel was in trouble. People today know Marvel as this unstoppable giant with billion-dollar films, but back then, Marvel was on the edge of bankruptcy. The company had sold off many of its iconic characters just to survive. Spider-Man was with Sony, the X-Men were with Fox, and Marvel was left with what many considered their second-tier heroes. And at the center of their desperate gamble was Iron Man, a character who was far from being a household name. Marvel had a plan. They wanted to create their own cinematic universe, starting with Iron Man in 2008. But here's the problem. No studio believed in Iron Man, and no studio believed in Robert Downey Jr. either. Marvel needed someone who could embody Tony Stark, this genius billionaire with flaws, charisma, and a hidden heart. They needed someone who wasn't just playing the part, but someone who was the part. Jon Favreau, the director of Iron Man, fought for Robert Downey Jr. He saw what others didn't. He saw a man who had lived through the chaos, who had experienced the highs and lows of fame, who had battled his own demons, and who could channel all of that into a character who wasn't perfect, but real. Marvel executives were hesitant. Hiring Robert was a massive risk. If he failed, the entire Marvel dream would collapse before it even began. But destiny has its own way of aligning. And then it happened. Robert Downey Jr. became Tony Stark, not just in the film, not just in costume, but in spirit. When Iron Man released in 2008, it didn't just launch a film, it launched a revolution. Robert brought Tony Stark to life in a way no one else could. The arrogance, the wit, the humor, the vulnerability, it was all him. And audiences didn't just see a superhero. They saw a man who reflected their own imperfections, their own struggles, their own journey of redemption. The film was a massive success, and with it, Marvel was reborn. That one risk, that one casting choice became the foundation of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Without Robert Downey Jr., there might never have been the Avengers, no Infinity War, no Endgame. Marvel didn't just find its star, they found its savior. But here's what makes it truly powerful. For Robert, this wasn't just about playing a role, this was his second chance at life. Every time he wore that suit, every time he delivered those lines, it wasn't just acting, it was Robert reminding himself and the world that no matter how broken you are, you can rebuild. No matter how many mistakes you've made, you can still rise to greatness. He became Iron Man, but in reality, Iron Man became him. Over the next decade, Robert Downey Jr. carried Marvel on his shoulders. From Iron Man to the Avengers, from Civil War to Infinity War, he became the heart of the MCU. And when the world watched Avengers Endgame in 2019 and Tony Stark whispered those unforgettable words, "I am Iron Man," before sacrificing himself to save the universe, it wasn't just the end of a character, it was the culmination of Robert's entire journey. A man who was once broken, lost and dismissed had risen to become a legend. He didn't just play a superhero, he lived as one. But let's pause here, because this story isn't just about Hollywood or Marvel or billion-dollar box offices. This is about life. Robert Downey Jr.'s journey is a mirror for all of us. How many times have we felt broken? How many times have we fallen so far that we wondered if we could ever rise again? How many times have people doubted us, whispered about our failures, written us off? That's the human story. And Robert's life proves that no matter where you are, no matter how dark it seems, there is always a way back, a way. He once said, "Remember that just because you hit rock bottom doesn't mean you have to stay there." Think about that. Rock bottom is not the end. It's the foundation upon which you can rebuild your life. Robert's story reminds us that failure is not permanent, that mistakes do not define us, and that redemption is always possible. Today, Robert Downey Jr. is celebrated as one of the greatest comeback stories in Hollywood. He went from jail cells to red carpets, from being unemployable to becoming the highest-paid actor in the world. But his true legacy isn't the fame or the money. His legacy is the hope he gives to every person who feels lost. His legacy is the reminder that no matter how flawed you are, no matter how broken your past, you still have the power to rise. Marvel may have been saved by Iron Man, but in reality, Robert Downey Jr. saved Marvel because he saved himself first. And that is what makes his story timeless. Because the truth is, the world doesn't need perfect heroes. The world needs real ones. Heroes who have scars, heroes who have fallen, heroes who know what it's like to suffer but still choose to rise. Robert Downey Jr. became that hero, not just for Marvel, but for millions around the world. And his story is proof that you too can rebuild, reinvent, and rise to become your own hero. Robert Downey Jr.'s story after Iron Man wasn't just about playing a character. It became a reflection of how a man, once trapped in his worst mistakes, could stand as a global symbol of redemption. The success of Iron Man in 2008 shocked the world. Suddenly, a man who was once considered too unreliable to insure for a film became the cornerstone of what would turn into the most powerful franchise in movie history. But that kind of transformation doesn't come without weight. When you rise from ashes, the spotlight doesn't just shine, it burns. And Robert knew this. He knew the pressure of carrying not just a character, but a studio's survival. Marvel had gambled everything. If Iron Man had failed, Marvel might have collapsed. But it didn't fail. It soared, and Robert's performance was the heartbeat. Still, success has its own challenges. Fame can be just as dangerous as failure. When the world begins to see you as a hero, it's easy to fall into the trap of believing the mask more than the man. Robert had to navigate this delicate balance, staying grounded while the world treated him like the very superhero he played. What makes Robert's journey so powerful is that he didn't run from his past. He didn't pretend to be flawless. Instead, he embraced the fact that his scars, his failures, his humiliations, those very things gave him the depth to play Tony Stark in a way no one else could. Think about Tony Stark's arc, a billionaire playboy who is arrogant, flawed, reckless, but through pain, failure, and sacrifice, becomes a hero who saves others. That wasn't just fiction, that was Robert's reality. He wasn't acting, he was living the truth of a flawed man seeking redemption. As Marvel expanded, so did his influence. He reprised the role in Iron Man 2, The Avengers, Iron Man 3, and countless interconnected films that built towards something never seen before, a cinematic universe where stories collided, characters evolved, and fans became part of a cultural phenomenon. And at the center of it all stood Robert Downey Jr. He wasn't just Marvel's leading man, he was its soul. But success stories aren't just about the wins, they're about the sacrifices. While Robert was saving Marvel on screen, off-screen he was making conscious decisions to stay disciplined, focused, and anchored in a way he hadn't been before. The temptation of falling back into old habits is always there, especially in Hollywood where excess surrounds you. But Robert knew he couldn't afford to lose himself again. Not for Marvel, not for his fans, and most importantly, not for himself and his family. He held on to routines, leaned on his wife Susan, and practiced habits that grounded him. He became a man who refused to let the past define the future. And perhaps that's one of the greatest lessons in his story. Discipline isn't about being perfect. It's about building a system that protects you from yourself. It's about creating a foundation so strong that even when the storms come, you don't collapse. Robert had spent years self-destructing, but in this chapter of his life, he became intentional about building himself back up. The world responded. Audiences didn't just love Tony Stark, they loved Robert Downey Jr. He was charming in interviews, witty on red carpets, brutally honest about his past, and unashamed of the man he had become. People admired him not because he was flawless, but because he had been broken and still found the courage to rise. His life became a beacon for anyone struggling with addiction, with failure, with self-doubt. If Robert could turn his life around, so could they. Marvel films began dominating box offices across the world. Each new release was an event, and with each passing year, Robert became more than an actor. He became the face of a movement. Think about the courage it takes to step back into an industry that once threw you out, to risk being judged again, and then to not only survive but to dominate. That is the essence of resilience. And then came the cultural phenomenon that was The Avengers in 2012. For the first time, audiences saw their favorite heroes unite on screen. It was epic, it was groundbreaking, and it worked because at the heart of it was Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark. His humor, his arrogance, his eventual humility, it tied everything together. And with that, Marvel's dream became a reality. Billion-dollar films became the norm, and Robert became one of the highest-paid actors in Hollywood. But let's not make the mistake of thinking this was just about money or fame. For Robert, this was personal. Every scene he played, every moment as Tony Stark, was a reminder to himself and to the world that second chances matter, that no matter how broken your past, your future can still shine brighter than ever. And then came Iron Man 3 in 2013. In many ways, this film was Robert's most personal as Tony. It wasn't just about suits or battles, it was about vulnerability, trauma, and identity. Tony Stark faced panic attacks, insecurity, and the question of who he really was without the armor. Doesn't that sound familiar? Robert had lived that. He knew what it was like to wonder who he was without the spotlight, without the mask. That film wasn't just storytelling, it was therapy. It was Robert sharing his own truth through the lens of a superhero. Marvel kept building towards something massive, and Robert kept leading the way. Avengers: Age of Ultron, Captain America, Civil War, Spider-Man: Homecoming, Infinity War, all of them revolved around Tony Stark in one way or another. His character evolved, matured, and eventually became the father figure of the entire Marvel universe. Fans didn't just watch Tony Stark, they grew with him, and through Tony, they grew with Robert. But then came 2019, the year everything changed. Avengers. Endgame wasn't just a film, it was a cultural event. It was the culmination of 22 movies, a decade of storytelling, and the ending of a chapter that millions of fans had grown up with. And at the center of it was Robert Downey Jr. For 11 years he had carried Marvel. For 11 years he had given everything to Tony Stark. And in that final moment, when Tony looks at Thanos, snaps his fingers and says, "I am Iron Man," the world erupted. But behind those words was a depth far greater than fiction, because those words weren't just Tony Stark's, they were Robert Downey Jr.'s. It was his declaration. After all the arrests, the drugs, the failures, the doubt, the world that gave up on him, he was standing tall, victorious, untouchable. That line wasn't just about saving the universe, it was about saving himself. He was Iron Man, not just on screen, but in life. And as Tony Stark sacrificed himself for the greater good, Robert Downey Jr. cemented his place in cinematic history. When fans walked out of theaters, they weren't just crying for Tony Stark, they were crying for Robert. They were mourning the end of a journey that had inspired them, moved them, and reminded them that even the most flawed among us can become heroes. But what makes Robert's story even more profound is what came after. Most actors, after achieving that level of success, might cling desperately to it. But Robert didn't. He knew that being Iron Man was the greatest chapter of his career, but he also knew it didn't have to be the only one. He stepped out of the suit with grace, with gratitude, and with the knowledge that his legacy was secure. He wasn't running from his past anymore. He wasn't chasing validation anymore. He had become whole. And that's the message for all of us. Your past doesn't define you. Your failures don't imprison you. What matters is how you rise, how you fight, how you decide to rebuild. Robert Downey Jr. became the man who saved Marvel, but in reality, he was the man who saved himself. And that's a lesson each of us can carry. Think about your own life. Maybe you've made mistakes that haunt you. Maybe you've fallen so far you don't know how to stand again. Maybe the world has written you off, called you unreliable, told you you're finished. But Robert's story is proof that none of that matters. You can still write your comeback. You can still become the hero of your own story. And here's the truth. Comebacks aren't just about one big moment. They're about thousands of small choices. Every day, Robert chose discipline over temptation. Every day, he chose belief over doubt. Every day, he chose to rise, even when it was easier to fall. That's what greatness is. It's not about one victory, it's about persistence. When we look at Robert Downey Jr., we don't just see Iron Man. We see the possibility within ourselves. The possibility that even if we've been broken, we can be rebuilt. The possibility that even if we've been doubted, we can be proven right. The possibility that no matter how dark our past, our future can shine brighter than we ever imagined. Robert once said, "I think you end up doing the stuff you were supposed to do at the time you were supposed to do it." And maybe that's the secret. Maybe everything, his failures, his arrests, his broken years, wasn't just pain, but preparation. Preparation for a role that would not only save Marvel, but inspire millions. Preparation to remind the world that the most powerful stories aren't about gods or aliens, but about broken men who find the strength to rise. And in that truth, we find the real legacy of Robert Downey Jr. Not just as Iron Man, not just as the man who saved Marvel, but as proof that redemption is possible, that second chances are real, and that heroes don't have to be perfect. They just have to rise when it matters most. When the world talks about legends, we often picture those who never falter, who never fall, who walk through life with unshakable strength. But real legends are not made of perfection. They are made of brokenness, of scars, of redemption. Robert Downey Jr.'s story is not the story of a man who never made mistakes. It's the story of a man who made every mistake possible and still refused to let that be the end. That is why his journey transcends Hollywood. That is why his legacy is more than Marvel. It is a universal truth: you can rise again. Robert's transformation didn't end when Tony Stark snapped his fingers in Endgame. In many ways, that was just the cinematic climax of a much deeper personal narrative. What came after was equally important. Post-Marvel, Robert chose roles carefully, but more importantly, he chose life deliberately. He invested in family, in meaningful work, in philanthropy. He built foundations, supported environmental causes, and began using his platform not just to entertain, but to heal and inspire. He could have become trapped in the shadow of Iron Man forever. Many actors are defined by a single role, unable to move beyond it. But Robert had already been through too much to let one chapter, no matter how iconic, confine him. He had learned the art of reinvention, and with that, the art of freedom. He proved that you can honor your past without being imprisoned by it. And that lesson is vital for all of us. How many times do we let one failure, one mistake, one bad chapter define the entire book of our lives? How many times do we believe that because we fell once, we must remain on the ground forever? Robert's journey screams the opposite. You can fail 1,000 times and still one comeback can change everything. You can be dismissed by the world and still one victory can rewrite your destiny. Look at Marvel today. A global empire worth billions, an endless stream of stories, a cultural phenomenon that touches every generation. None of that would exist without Robert Downey Jr. None of that would exist without a man who once sat in a jail cell, hopeless, forgotten, written off. That is the power of one life, one decision, one relentless refusal to give up. But let's make this personal. Imagine your own Marvel. Not the movies, not the characters, but your dreams, your passions, the thing that lights your soul on fire. Maybe right now that dream looks impossible. Maybe it looks bankrupt, just like Marvel did in the early 2000s. Maybe everyone around you is saying it's over, it's finished, it will never work. But if Robert's story teaches us anything, it's that one person's rise can revive an entire empire. And maybe, just maybe, you are that person for your own life. It won't be easy. Comebacks never are. There will be nights where you doubt yourself, days where the whispers of failure echo louder than your hope. There will be people who laugh at you, people who call you unreliable, people who don't see what you see. But remember this, Robert Downey Jr. was once told he was uninsurable, unemployable, unredeemable. And yet, he became the man who saved Marvel. He became the hero who carried the greatest cinematic universe of our generation. If he could rise from that, then what excuse do we have to give up on ourselves? The truth is, every one of us wears an invisible suit of armor. Not the kind made of iron, but the kind made of resilience, courage, and willpower. Every time you fight through a struggle, you're building that suit. Every time you face a setback and rise, you're adding another layer. And one day you'll look back and realize you've been your own Iron Man all along. And let's not forget the most important part of Robert's journey. He didn't do it alone. His wife Susan was his anchor. Jon Favreau fought for him when studios doubted. Marvel took the gamble. Life's greatest comebacks are never built in isolation. You need people who believe in you, people who remind you of your worth when you forget it yourself. So if you're listening to this right now, remember, find your anchors. Find the people who lift you higher, not drag you lower. And be that anchor for someone else, because no hero rises alone. Robert's life is proof that vulnerability and strength are not opposites. They are partners. His openness about his struggles, his honesty about his failures, made people connect with him in ways that perfection never could. We admired Tony Stark's genius, but we loved Robert's humanity. And that's what made him more than an actor. He became a symbol. Ask yourself, what if Robert had given up? What if he had believed the headlines, accepted the failure, and disappeared into oblivion? The world would never have seen Iron Man, never have witnessed Marvel's rebirth, never have been inspired by his rise. Which means this, your comeback is not just about you. It's about everyone who will be inspired, lifted, saved, or healed by watching you rise. Your courage becomes someone else's hope. Your fight becomes someone else's reason to keep going. That is the legacy of Robert Downey Jr. It's not just the billion-dollar films or the iconic lines, it's the lives he has touched, the people who saw him fall and rise and thought, if he can do it, maybe I can too. And that's where this story collides with yours. Because you are not just a spectator, You are not just someone watching from the sidelines. You are writing your own comeback story right now. Maybe your Iron Man suit is your education, your career, your art, your health, your relationships. Maybe your battle is not against aliens or villains, but against addiction, self-doubt, poverty, or heartbreak. Whatever it is, your fight is real. And just like Robert, you have a choice. You can let it break you, or you can let it build you. There is a line Tony Stark delivers that perfectly captures Robert's journey. It's not about how much we lost, it's about how much we have left. That's life. You may have lost years, opportunities, relationships, chances, but what do you still have left? Breath in your lungs, strength in your heart, the possibility of tomorrow, and as long as you have that, your story isn't over. Remember, when Robert was at his lowest, he didn't know he would one day save Marvel. He didn't know he would be Iron Man. He only knew that he couldn't stay broken forever. That's the same choice before you. You may not know where the road will lead. You may not know what destiny has waiting. But you do know this: you can rise, you can rebuild, you can create a legacy that outlives the pain. And maybe one day, when people look back at your journey, they won't just see the mistakes or the failures. They'll see the hero who refused to quit. They'll see the Iron Man of their own lives, the one who proved that redemption, resilience, and reinvention are always possible. So as we close Robert's story, let it be the spark for yours. Stand tall even if you've fallen 1,000 times. Believe even if the world calls you crazy. Fight even when the battle feels impossible, because your story is not over. And like Robert Downey Jr., you may one day look back and realize you weren't just wearing the suit, you were the suit. You weren't just playing the hero, you became one. And when that day comes, when you rise from your own ashes and claim your destiny, you'll understand the truth Robert Downey Jr. lived. Heroes are not born, they are built.